I would really like a class to go well. And sometimes folks fall out and it's all right. Like that does happen. A water bottle might spill and make noise and that's okay, right? I think sometimes not aiming for perfection, just aiming for authenticity.
Welcome back to season 2 of the How We Can Heal podcast. I so enjoyed sharing season 1 with you, and we have some incredible guests coming on for season 2. I created this podcast because the hard times seem to just keep on coming these days. These guests and I have committed our lives to healing work and to fostering health and joy in the world, even as we work through the impacts of trauma and face deep challenges. So let's dive in and let's all keep talking about how we can heal. Today, our guest is Erica Chang. Erica has practiced yoga since 2010 and completed her 200-hour yoga teacher certification with Pamela Higley at Samdhana Karana Yoga. She's also completed the Yoga Behind Bars training and volunteered at Remann Hall teaching yoga and meditation to youth. With yoga, Erica has found a melding of the best things in her life: spirit, athleticism, sweat, breath, laughter, community, and rhythm. Her goal as an instructor is to offer a space to explore, allowing others to become curious about what they're capable of as they leave a little stronger, a little softer, and a lot more balanced. Erica and I first connected when she began her yoga practice back in 2010, and she attended my yoga classes at YogaWorks in San Francisco. She was such a regular, she had her spot in the room, back left as the teacher looks at it, back right as you're looking forward to the front of class. And she had some favorite songs on the playlist. She always brought positive energy and helped build a sense of community within the class. I loved having her in class as a student, and I'm so glad to share her work with youth and as a yoga teacher with you today. Let's welcome Erica on the show. Erica!
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited to have you on the How We Can Heal podcast. How are things going? How's everything in Seattle?
It's good. So I moved to Tacoma about 8 years ago. It'll be 8 years in July.
Stop it. It's been 8 years?
Well, I think since I've moved, but yeah.
I was going to guess like 3.
No, it's been a while.
Wow.
Yeah,
Oh, and you're in Tacoma, right? Or you're teaching in Tacoma?
I'm in Tacoma. Yeah.
Okay. So we met, it must have been in like 2009. Does that sound about right to you? When I was teaching yoga at YogaWorks in San Francisco. And, I just have to share like one of my favorite memories of you is you and Carlos. Shout out to Carlos Hurtado in the back of the room. And I was always playing music, and you guys were like the back of the bus. And so I would play the Outcast song, Back of the Bus, and you guys would dance. Like you'd be in your downward dog, like dancing. And I just loved it. It brought me so much joy as a teacher just to see like you guys were just like anchor points in the room, right? And just regulars and showing up with joy. And I just so appreciated that. So whenever I see you out on social media or something, I just smile because I have fond memories. It was so good to have you in class.
No, and like your class was one of the first yoga classes that I've ever been to. So
I love that because yoga is such a big part of your life right now, right?
it is. Yeah.
It is. It is. That's an honor. And yeah, it's been a number of years. It's been some time. So, what made you show up at that first yoga class? What was going on in your life and what drew you to YogaWorks in San Francisco and to I don't know, it was probably the 2-3 vinyasa at 7 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yes, it was. So what drew me to yoga, I was going to grad school in San Francisco, and I remember I was in the midst of writing my thesis, which was on memory and mourning in 20th century literature and art. So I think I just needed something to distract myself with. Um, and yoga was a big part of the San Francisco culture at that time. And I just stumbled across YogaWorks. I took a class, and I'm forgetting which studio it was, but I took a class and I bought a mat the next day. And I kept going and I was trying out different studios, what worked, what didn't work, learning, you know, what kind of style I liked, and how I can get out of my head and just into my body.
Yes. So, what did you like? This feels very self-serving, but I'm like, what did you like about my class? What drew you? What like you kept coming back, you know? I loved having you there. What was it?
I liked how inviting it seemed, right? I think sometimes just being in the yoga scene for as long as I've been in, so maybe what, that puts me at 12 years now. It's really heartwarming when a teacher is just very welcoming. The class is very inclusive. People feel like they have a space of belonging and they can do it. And I think you offered a lot of different options. I remember the first time there was a headstand, I was like, oh, no, thank you. And you're like, well, maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow. Like, okay. And I did it. And I was just like, yeah, maybe tomorrow. Like, it doesn't have to be at this moment. Like, take my time, listen to my body, and just trust that this could happen.
Yeah, that reminds me of a woman I went through teacher training with, Jo Tastula, who's from Australia. And she talked about learning headstand in our training. And, you know, people can have a whole life of yoga without doing headstand or other inversions for that matter. But she's like, I was in India and I did it, and everyone in the room went up into headstand and I didn't know how to do it. So, and this isn't like the recommended, I think you would agree, not the recommended way to learn headstand. She's like, so I went up and I fell down and I went up and I fell down and I went up and I stayed and then I fell down. And then that next magical time, you know, so she's kind of telling that story. Yeah, there's some intimidating things I think in yoga. So it is nice. It's wonderful for me to hear that it felt inclusive and inviting and safe in that way that you didn't feel like, okay, everybody's doing headstand, I have to do it right now, right? Like that it's you can just leave the opportunity. Like maybe tomorrow. We'll see.
Right. And I think it was just very approachable. Like, there were different things that we could try on, and like, you let us do what felt best for us, like us, me and Carlos dancing in the back.
Fondest memories. Like when I do think of teaching there, that's probably one of the first things I think about. Yeah, there was a back row and then Alyssa in the corner. There was like a back row and a front row. That was like always on point. Like the corners of the room were held down and then people would fill in the middle. Such good memories. Yeah, I do miss that place. And I know it's not there anymore because I think Yoga Works closed its doors. I don't know if it's still a studio, but amazing how things can change in 12 years. I do remember you were a student and I do remember you talking about just stress management, right? That it would sort of help. Um, what did you find as you started practicing yoga? What was it, you know, what was it that you were feeling internally that made you want to keep coming back or that made you just keep digging into yoga so that it's become a part of your life the way that it is now?
I think what has stayed with me is like being able to listen to my breath. I think sometimes in today's society, we're on the go constantly. And I get this way too. Like when I'm going on a hike, I'm like, this is a destination. This is where I need to be. I don't need to pay attention to other things. But I think with yoga, if I'm able to listen to my breath, I'm able to understand like why my body might feel tired, why I might feel okay or have a lot of energy, and being able to take the time to be aware of that.
Yeah, it gives you that space to connect, right? Like, okay, this is what I need right now. And, you know, some of those tools of like just attuning to your breath, noticing what it's doing, shifting it if need be. You know, there's a lot of that internal awareness that can come rather than the pulled out into going here, doing this, doing that, running all over the place, which is very, I mean, very common, I would say, around the world these days, but it's also very much American culture to just go and not rest. So I'm wondering, how has your relationship with yoga changed over time?
Yeah, so I think when I first started doing yoga, I wanted to do all the challenging poses. I also know that I'm very type A. Like, oh, yes, give me a challenge and I want to do it. I think my way of teaching yoga is to do a lot of repetition to build muscle memory and to learn. And also be creative, right? Like a Sun A can be very different from a Sun A that I created a week ago. But allowing students to feel it a couple of times to understand, like, oh, like maybe you're holding your breath. Are you doing it again? Are you able to relax and like really be in the pose and the posture?
And at what point did you start teaching? What called you to switch from, you know, just practicing on the mat to sharing it with other people?
Yeah, so the first year that I lived in Tacoma, I was trying out different yoga studios and like I'm investing a lot of time in this. why not do teacher training? And I didn't know if I wanted to be a teacher quite yet, but I was just like, there's so many things about yoga that I do not know. I know the asanas, I know the postures, but I don't know much about philosophy or the myths or um, Sanskrit or things like that. So how can I learn this? So yeah, I signed up, and then right after teacher training, I started teaching right away. I did not expect that, and I've been teaching for, I think it'll be 6 years now.
That's amazing. I've heard that story countless times, and it's mine too. Like, I just signed up for yoga teacher training because my own practice, I wanted to learn more. I was going to all the classes and doing all the workshops. It was the next logical step. And then the second you graduate, someone's like, "Do you want to teach here? We have a space for you." You're like, "Oh, okay, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I learned all this. I might as well." I've heard it so many times. So I do think there's something beautiful about that, the way that we're just kind of called into something. And I was talking with my mom, who it was episode 1 of this season, about that too, about just like feeling things forward and following your interest and your curiosity, and you know, opportunities show up, and it's always fascinating. Yeah, I never planned on becoming a yoga teacher, but here we are. And you've also been working with youth. Can you tell me a little bit more about that work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so let's see. When I started teaching yoga, I also had a scholarship for yoga behind bars. So I had the opportunity after taking that training to teach yoga at a youth detention center in Tacoma. So I did that for about 2 years. And at the same time, I was also working for a nonprofit that advocated or advocates for youth in foster care. So learning how systems are in place currently, how there are a lot of gaps and challenges for youth to get through and sometimes not always achieve what they would like to do. And then also learning about what life is like in a detention center, what youth have access to, what they don't have access to, and just giving them the opportunity to move their bodies as well.
I love that work, and I think that, probably around the same time that you were taking classes at Yoga Works, that I was doing a lot of that too, teaching yoga in juvenile halls. And I find that people are, I've known a lot of people who are very called to that type of work, so I wanna talk a little bit more about it. But I also find that people who haven't done it are often very curious about, well, what's it like to teach in a detention center, and what called you to do it. So I'm just curious about your experience there, and what stood out to you. What did you learn? What really resonated with you in that work?
What really resonated with me was that everyone was on the same playing ground. Like I walked in, I didn't wear traditional yoga clothes. Like I didn't have yoga leggings on. I didn't have anything that stood out. I wore sweatpants and socks as I was teaching. We were in a circle rather than being in a line like traditional classes. Um, and I just had them address me as Erica. Like there was nothing special or anything that stood out to me, even though I was also in a position of power. Like that was very much in the room, but realizing like how I can also put myself on equal playing ground as the other folks in the room. And also offering them an opportunity to move and learning how they could take care of their bodies. And I'm also learning it too, right? I'm in a space that I'm not familiar with, that might not be as vibrant as spaces that I typically am attracted to. Like there's not a lot of color, there are guards standing by the doors, things like that.
And did you have the opportunity to teach with the same group over time, or did you teach more of a drop-in class where people would come and go?
It was more of a drop-in class, but that's a great question. I think sometimes there were consistent students, but it also depended on how long they were staying at the center.
Yeah. I found there to be a big difference in the feeling of the class and the amount of, like, maybe not color in the room. Actually, we did a lot of art projects, so there was color in the rooms where I used to teach eventually, but But the amount of, like, vibrancy or feeling of connection that would come over time between classes with we had classes with youth who were committed to a certain program for 6 or even 9 months, and then there was the drop-in facility where it was very transient and, maybe someone would be there for a few weeks or a few months and come consistently, but it was more I had that, like, piecemeal feeling of, like, a little bit different every time. Maybe you start to get to know someone, but there was a different sort of palpable quality in the room between the drop-in, which had its own magic, and the long term. There was, like, a level of depth and relationship that showed up in the longer term ones. So I'm wondering if you ever felt like, as you're coming in and you're wearing sweatpants and socks and meeting people where they are, yes, you're in a position of power, but you're also there, to offer something and to be of support. Did you feel like you were able to, through teaching, develop relationships, or did it feel too transient, at that point?
Yeah, it felt a little transient. And I just read an article about creating space as a yoga teacher and how do you do that? It's consistency, right? So it made me reflect on, was I able to provide consistency and support to folks who were coming in and out of that space? And that's something that I think about when I'm entering a room teaching yoga. Like, do folks feel comfortable? Will they come back? Am I offering something that is supportive for them?
And that's a hard one because my experience with and this sort of connects with I know in the juvenile justice system, there's a big overlap with foster care and social services, and I've done a lot of work in group homes and other social services. So I feel like there's this overlap when you start looking at youth developing who are in those systems. There's usually a lot of experiences, or at least one major experience of a loss of trust with adults or with authority, or with systems. And so that can pose that challenge in terms of anyone coming in to offer writing or teach yoga or do whatever they're doing in these facilities. Uh, but it also there's such an opportunity there to, if you are showing up consistently and you're intentionally holding some kind of helpful or positive or supportive space, there's such an opportunity there for someone to develop a positive relationship, right? And even if it's just I know sometimes in those classes with higher turnover, sometimes it's as simple as someone leaves and, God forbid they come back in a few months, just as it happens, recidivism happens, and you remember their name or you remember that they really liked Shavasana or and you some whatever the thing is, and I feel like those moments carry weight, like they really matter. So, yeah, I'm just curious if anything like that stood out while you were teaching to the youth there.
Yeah, I think sometimes I would see youth come and then they would go back. And, the program, the yoga was optional for youth at the center, so they could come or not come. I was very interested in the folks who were coming, like, why were they coming? And I think back on, like, why I didn't ask that, right? Like, I'm curious on if they found it restful or restorative for them. And it's interesting that you bring up the idea of trust. So right now, my full-time job, I work for the Attorney General's office for their policy team, and we are creating a youth safety and well-being tip line. There are a lot of folks that might not trust a state agency or the Attorney General or those who are, higher officials. So how do I build that trust, right? How do I build trust with folks who might not know that this is an opportunity? So those are things that I also think about, like, in my daily life, right? Not just in yoga, but how do I create that space for folks?
Well, I think it's when you're working with human beings, right? You have to factor in relationships and how relationships develop. And there's that quote I always get on the yogi tea bags, love without trust is a river without water. It's like you really it's hard to build. It's hard to build something. Like if you don't trust someone, then what else is there, right? It's foundational. So I'm glad that you're doing that work and carrying it forward. And yeah, it applies in yoga, it applies beyond. And I do feel like, and you probably know this, and probably most people listening by now know this, like yoga has know that I believe this. Yoga has so many things to offer. One of them being that opportunity to build a relationship around something generative or positive. But there's so many other tools too. So I'm wondering, whether it was in your experience, teaching yoga or in what you're doing with the Attorney General right now, what are some of the tools that feel foundational that you come back to offer youth?
Yeah, I think being flexible, right? Like knowing that one thing might not fit. What are other opportunities or avenues I could take or offer someone? And I think about that when I put together a yoga sequence, right? Like, does this flow make sense? And then I'll work it through my body. And while I teach it, I watch how other folks react to it or how their body responds and think about, like, okay, so if I'm getting this reaction, what if I tried this instead next time? Um, yeah, while still trying to be creative.
Yeah, if you're getting like all the heads looking up at you confused or everyone going the opposite direction of what you were
Yeah,
intending,
like,
you're like,
oh, that's not what I meant.
that's what everyone heard though, right?
Exactly. Yeah, or I'm like, or your other right side.
Exactly. Whichever. I'm curious with all of this, is there anything you do to intentionally come with a trauma-informed approach?
That's a great question. So, how can I reduce or not cause harm to anyone who's been in the room? I think one of the ways that I do it is introduce myself, right? Like that way folks know who I am. They know how often I'm in that space. So I will always say, like, I teach at a local climbing gym. I let folks know who I am, how often I'm there, that they can come to me with any questions, concerns, or requests. So to create that particular space for them. Um, and to also let them know, like, this is how I teach. Like, I'm a teacher of flow. I really like movement, but if you are not feeling it, if I'm cueing things too quickly or too slowly, feel free to go at your own pace. Like, I really like it when folks listen to their body and maybe take something on that I'm not teaching, or they hang out in Shavasana for several minutes rather than what I'm offering, because they know their body best. I'm merely facilitating the space.
So you introduce yourself, you offer avenues for people to provide feedback, you offer choice, and you encourage people to trust their bodies and make a choice that's actually responsive to what they're feeling, especially if it's going against the grain of the energy or the flow that you're bringing as a teacher.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Sometimes we do things intentionally to be trauma informed, and sometimes we're just like, this just works. This just seems to be more helpful or more inclusive. There's a lot of overlap. And so, um, yeah, there's definitely overlap there. Is trauma something you talk about in your role with the Attorney General, or do you guys come at it from a different angle?
We talk about trauma as well. So this particular tip line that we're putting together will be youth centered. So getting youth input on what they would like this program to look like. Also trauma informed, right? Like working for a state agency, we know that there can be a lot of harm that have been caused on folks. So how can we either reduce that or create trust? Because if we don't have trust, we don't have a program, right? Like we don't have stakeholders who can provide us with input. Um, Also being aware that folks come from all walks of life. So being aware of how folks identify, how they might respond to us, especially if English is not their first language, especially if they are a refugee or an asylee or neurodivergent. Like, what are ways that we can be flexible and take on different methods or different approaches to learn from folks?
That's great. So it's really truly putting in work to be inclusive, right? Not just saying anyone's welcome here, but really thinking about who are we wanting to reach and include? What are their needs? How are they different? How are they similar? And trying to connect, right? And invite them in specifically. So, are you teaching yoga right now to youth at all? Or are you doing yoga on one thing and then the youth work separately?
Yeah, so I am doing the youth work separately. So, like I said, I was teaching at a local detention center. And because at that time I was working for a nonprofit that advocated for youth in foster care, it was challenging for me seeing some of the youth that I was working with in the centers, right? Like I didn't have a lot of separation, and it just became a conflict of interest. So I had to let something go, and I couldn't let my job go at that time. I have taught like pop up classes to youth. Um, I've taught pop up classes to teens, which I really love. And right now I'm just teaching to adults, which I really enjoy.
And are there tools that stand out to you that have been particularly helpful for the youth you've taught? It might be the same for adults, it might be different, but are there maybe things you find yourself coming back to again and again, or things that you feel like really take root and people share with you are more powerful?
Yeah, so I think this is always stuck. Like, just have fun teaching, right? Like, just embrace that there might be moments of folks who are falling out of things, and there's laughter, and they could always get back in or try something else on. I think sometimes I've done it too, right? Like I would really like a class to go well. And sometimes folks fall out and like, it's all right. Like that does happen. A water bottle might spill and make noise, and that's okay, right? I think sometimes not aiming for perfection, just aiming for authenticity.
Yeah. And what impact do you think that has? I mean, I can think of as a teacher the difference between everything has to go well and oh my god, a water bottle fell and what am I going to do? And oh, somebody's unstable in the pool and it means I'm not teaching right. Like that anxiety, that stress, and like as a teacher, embodying that is not fun. And we obviously are sort of sending out vibes and co-regulating as teachers. So I'm wondering, embracing that imperfection, if we're going to call it that, or just the authenticity and the reality of being human, and things wobbling and water spilling and just the realities of life. What do you think the impact of that is on students or on the experience of someone practicing with you?
It shows that everyone is human, right? Like you're not going to get it perfectly. So I think just teaching throughout the pandemic, at first, when the pandemic started, I was just recording classes on YouTube and Facebook Live. My camera was not perfect, right? Like you could hear me breathing as I was doing classes. I'm like, oh, this sounds great. And then being in spaces wearing a mask and learning how to speak louder because I'm talking through a mask. And then offering spaces where folks felt comfortable because I'm not doing adjustments right now. Classes are a little bit smaller. I'm not walking around seeing everyone like I would normally. So that has changed how I've taught classes, and being able to embrace that, right? Like being able to say, like, we're going to try our best, and hopefully this does work. And if not, like, we'll try it again next time.
Yeah, I love that. Coming back to, if not today, another day. It's fine.
Exactly.
There's always another day. So this brings up the whole teaching online. Are you still teaching online, or are you back?
I'm back to in person. So when the pandemic started, I think I was teaching online for about a year, and that was hard. Um, but it was also, I think towards the end, I was like, I'm talking to a screen. Talk on a screen for work, and now I'm doing it for yoga. But it's also being able to understand and listen to the cues that I was saying, and then being able to rephrase it or revise it when I taught next time, and then being able to do it in person. Just get a lot of gratitude for being able to teach still.
Yeah, and it's definitely great that we had the technology to stay connected somehow. And then, yeah, we get the screen fatigue. It comes with the territory. But was there anything you felt like you learned from? It sounds like you could kind of hear yourself and see things and reflect on your cueing. Was there anything else that stood out from teaching online?
I think what you said, like technology still offers us a way to connect with other folks, right? Like I'm still connected to you. We haven't seen each other in person in a long time, but I see all the adventures that you're doing. And yeah,
Yeah, there is a real sense of connection. And I find right now, especially live, like I've done a few classes and trainings and they have my go-to recorded things that I love. But when there is an opportunity for us to like be together, right? And interact. Like there's so much value in that. Even if it's not 3D, right? Even if it's not, but what was it like for you going back into the studio? Was it just a big, I mean, there's all the mask and all the regulations, but was it a big sigh of relief? Did anything stand out to you as you transitioned back to in person?
It just made me so grateful that there are students in the room, right? And they wanted to move their bodies as much as I wanted to move mine, that they were there for yoga, right? And that's so moving because it also reminds me why I go back to the mat as well. Like why I practice is for the opportunity to find space and movement.
Does the word transformation resonate for you when you think about yoga?
It does. So I'm currently taking a yoga training with a teacher in Seattle, and her question when we first started the training was, how did yoga transform your life? And like, if I didn't do yoga, I would not know the community that I know. I would not have made so many connections or friends. I would not be so in tuned with my body. I would not know what it's like to be grounded. So I think I did mention that I'm very type A and I'm aware of it. But being able to take time and listen has taught me a lot, not only about myself, but how I approach things.
And is there any transformation you've seen or heard about from students? I know sometimes as teachers, we're facilitating, we don't get the whole story. Sometimes in those, other settings like working with youth, working in juvenile halls or programs, we get a little more of a window in. But have you seen anyone who's, been through something powerful through their yoga practice?
Yeah, I think, it's the little things like someone can get in an arm balance and they're like, oh, that's great. I'm like, yeah, that's awesome, right? Like I've seen that you've worked hard, but I also have seen folks like take a longer shavasana, like I mentioned, and how powerful that can be. I've also seen folks who have worked through an injury, right? Like I like to teach a lot of hip openers and I like to teach a lot of balancing postures. So to watch someone being able to balance longer than they have done before is really powerful. And for them to tell me at the end of class, like, hey, I was not able to do that months ago. And I would say, like, oh, I didn't know that. And they'll tell me about things like that have happened to them. Like, that's really awesome.
It's that, a lot of times it's like a little microcosm, right? Your yoga practice and the things you bring and repeating things, and this comes from yoga philosophy too, but repeating things with intention, but also with a little bit of surrender, right? Like I'm going to show up and I'm going to keep doing this. And it's not necessarily have this goal. I'm balancing on one leg in tree for 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Like, but over time, we just, our bodies, our minds, our brains, everything just adapts and develops habits. And then next thing you know, something that felt really overwhelming or felt impossible feels kind of mundane, right? Like I've definitely been in classes where even teaching tree for 3 minutes, people are like, oh, but it's tree pose. We do it all the time. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not Uchita Hasta Gustasana. That one's harder. You start to like, and the thing there's a lot of communities I've been involved with that have this, but the thing that I appreciate and can be a challenge about yoga in terms of the physical postures and asana and in terms of breath work is there's always something more, right? There's always something more challenging or a little bit crazier. And it does get to the point, I think, with asana where we have to learn from the generations of teachers who have said, "Ooh, actually this shape isn't good for your body." Like this is contortion level that's really not good for most bodies. Like there are those things I think in terms of the sacroiliac joint and our cervical spine and things that we've sort of learned, through pretty serious practitioners and teachers getting injured and then figuring it out and then they pass it on like, "Actually, let's do this a little differently." But there is always another level of challenge. And that can be such a gift because, if you plateau or if you feel like you're getting bored, well, here, try this, try something new, try closing your eyes, then try lifting one hand or whatever. There's always something else. But it can also, I think, for someone who is maybe type A or very accomplishment oriented, it can be frustrating, right? Because you never check the box. You're never like done, which is such a lesson in and of itself, right?
I also think it's being able to appreciate that it's a journey, right? Like we don't have to get to the destination, and being able to savor each moment and each pose until the end.
And there's that microcosm again. There's that lesson of process, right? So it's like authenticity over perfection, progress, process over result. But there is a little bit, and I appreciate this about yoga philosophy, there is a little bit of like holding an intention or holding a vision or having a direction, right? But not like clinging to it so tightly that our self-worth and our, sense of being okay is entwined in it. So what's your yoga practice look like now?
So I used to love practicing every day. When it's summer, especially in the Pacific Northwest, I'm outdoors all the time. So I probably make it to my mat 2 to 3 times a week. And it's not an hour long class, it's just what feels best for my body. And I'm also okay with that, right? Like, I think before I'd be going to classes pretty regularly, and now I'm just doing a home practice, and being able to find poses that really resonate for me and my body, right? Like, and that's also teaching myself like where I need to be at the moment.
I hear this from so many teachers. I feel like there's this trajectory I've seen, or a common theme where, people get into yoga, they feel a lot of benefit, they get really interested, keep coming back, take a lot of classes, start taking workshops, take teacher training, that whole journey we just outlined earlier. Finish teacher training, whether or not they intended to, start teaching, right? Somewhere, somehow. And then I see people, I don't know if this happened to you at any point, maybe when you were talking about, having to let something go and letting go of the jobs in the juvenile detention center. But at a certain point, I feel like people are so enthused and excited about yoga and giving it everywhere that then they're not actually feeding themselves with the practice anymore. Like their whole life becomes yoga. And then there's like, I don't know, their own practice gets squeezed out of the margins. Did that ever happen to you?
Oh, for sure. It happens all the time. I am also a person who's like, I have other interests, right? Like there are other things I want to fill my life with. Um, but I did think about that. Like I do think about it pretty regularly. Like if I wasn't teaching, what would I make space and time for? And do I want to do that? And how much of yoga is encompassing my life? And do I really enjoy it? Right? So finding that balance as well.
And that comes back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of having fun as a teacher, right? Because if you're doing it out of this obligation or just rote habit, it sort of starts to feel stale. But if you're doing it out of passion or out of interest, or you're having fun with it, then that's a really different flavor. And the last thing I wanted to track with that journey is it gets squeezed out. But then I also think when you learn about yoga philosophy, everything starts to feel like yoga. You're like making a decision, you're communicating in a relationship, you're going for a run, you're taking a rest. And like, even if it's not on a yoga mat or it's not okay, this is my sequence time or this is my pranayama time, it starts to sort of blend and bleed into everything. Uh, and then I find exactly what you just described, which is it really becomes this practice of what do I need right now? How is this going to serve me today? Once you have, and I think about as I was kind of coming up in the yoga world in Santa Monica in like the late 90s, there were a lot of people practicing Ashtanga yoga really seriously, Iyengar yoga really seriously. People Iyengar sessions could be like 3 hours a day. Ashtangis doing their like primary, secondary, however many series every day except on full moons, maybe new moons too. And there was just that intensity about it where it's like if you're a yogi, you're like every day on the mat grinding. And I remember for myself when my practice became a little more like, what do I need right now? And this is what I need right now. Struggling a little bit with that. Like, well, isn't it supposed to look this way or that way? And then really looking back and going, okay, these are the teachers I learned from, like the founders of Yoga Works were, really steeped in Ashtanga, and there were a lot of leaders in Yoga Works really steeped in Iyengar Yoga as well. And then I thought, okay, that's them. And then their teachers who created this sequence are, one generation above that. And then wait, what's before that? Like, let me trace back in the world of yoga to what about that those what okay, so now I'm tracing back, okay, like Mati and Chuck to, their Ashtanga teacher to Krishnamacharya was the teacher of all these other big teachers. Well, who taught Krishnamacharya? What about before that? Like, let's really look back. Yoga is this tradition that's very well steeped in the culture and the country of India. We, pay homage to that. We respect that. We want to honor that. And so why do we mentally stop with, I have to be doing primary series or I have to, and if it works for you, great. But in my mind, I was like, oh, there was a moment of sort of reckoning with that. Like, it doesn't have to look this way that like during my early yoga development, I saw as a model. It doesn't have to fit into that for it to be right in a certain way, right? Or for me to be doing the practice the way I should be. So it was really, it's interesting to see and hear so many teachers have this similar trajectory. And I think specifically in a trauma-informed way, and when you're factoring in and focusing on mental and emotional health and nervous system health and all these things where we talk about more these days, it makes so much sense to look to all the tools you've learned. Like, you couldn't spend all day doing every yoga practice you've learned at this point. You've learned so much stuff that it's like a lifetime of tools. And then every day going into that tool bag and going, "Oh, face down shavasana," which has been one of my favorites for a while. Face down shavasana. Oh, some balancing, some even breathing, some longer exhales, some like, and just pulling those things. And so when I think of and when I work with people who are recovering from trauma and using yoga, it's very much that tool bag effect. So it kind of sounds like that's where you are now of what are my what do I need right now? And let me just bring that on my mat and remember that I'm a whole person and have a lot of other interests too.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why I feel this way, and like this is a feeling that sometimes pops in and out, is how yoga is presented in today's society, right? Like, are there folks that look like me? Are there folks with bigger bodies or other health ailments or disabilities? Are they being offered a space? And I think about that when folks show up to my class. Like, you know, I would love to work with a wide variety of folks. Are those the folks that come to yoga, right? And if not, like, what are ways that I can create that space?
And I love that you're doing that and that more and more teachers are consciously bringing that in. I think about some of the spaces I was in early on that there was this sort of background emphasis on, and these are kind of scary words like purity or like, there was like, there was like, you can get all the toxins out, right? If you just become vegan and juice every day. And like when you start getting into diet, you start getting into lifestyle. And there are some things in the philosophy of yoga where we can really reflect, but there were some cultures that were starting to feel prescriptive and like, well, if you're not these things and if this isn't the lifestyle that works for you, well, then you're not allowed here. And if you don't look the way the teacher does, well, that's because of you. That's because of your impure choices or whatever, right? Like, and it's not always said, but it's a subtext. And I think it's a dangerous one because we don't know what everyone's coming with physically, mentally, emotionally. Yoga teachers, we're not doctors. We don't we don't know a lot, all of us. Like, we know some things and there's a lot we don't know. It gets dangerous, right? It gets to this like in that sort of pursuit of some weirdly defined form of perfection and folds all into what we see in the media and our social structures in the world and power structures and all of that. And so does it feel like there's a lot of people around you who are intentionally going, okay, how can we put that to rest? How can we bring up this sense of inclusivity and acceptance and honoring and respecting our bodies and giving them what they need? I feel like there's a shift in that way. Would you say so?
There's a shift, and those are the folks that I gravitate towards, right? Like when I see things on social media about like, oh, if you do this yoga posture, you can lose a certain amount of weight. Like, I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in, you know, what feels good, right? And I think about where I put myself in spaces. Like, are there folks that feel comfortable being in these spaces, right? Um, And if not, why is that?
And that's a really good question to ask, and it makes me think back to the work you're doing with the Attorney General of, let's think about how we can make this accessible, not just say, "Everyone's invited," but say, what might prevent someone or what might be challenging for someone in this circumstance or with this identity to access what we're offering, and can we cross that bridge so that they don't so that it's not a barrier on their end, right? So that they don't have to try to figure that out, but you're actively figuring it out. So are there places, you wanna bring yoga moving forward?
Yeah, so I was co-owner of a yoga company called Yoga Wild. So we would teach classes outdoors and in museums, and getting folks from all over Tacoma to join. There was a sliding scale, and people felt really included, right? Because we would not only promote things that were happening in the city, but also volunteer at litter pickups, at beach cleanups, things like that, and letting folks know what's happening. I think sometimes folks, they're interested, or like they find out things at the last moment, but being socially aware on what's happening, and how we can take care of our environment so we can take care of ourselves. I think I would be very interested in bringing yoga into like teen shelters. That's something that I'm interested in because I am doing a lot of outreach to find out where youth are going in the state of Washington. So being able to provide youth with a tool like yoga would be really helpful and really inspiring for me.
Yes. You speak to my heart. I wish I could, like, watch or listen to this podcast, 15 or 10, however many years ago it was. I'd be like, "Oh my god, Erica, I love it." The trajectories is very inspiring, and there's a lot of, like, interweave and overlap that I don't think either of us were aware of when I was teaching at Yoga Works and you were coming there as a student. So, yeah, it's really beautiful to hear and see. So we got to start to wrap up. And I'm just curious, when you think about, obviously there's been thing after thing in the world in the last few years have been excessively challenging. When you think of, someone who might be struggling right now, what would you say to them? It could be sort of a yoga invitation, or it could just be general sort of insight or advice. What comes to mind?
So someone gave me this advice recently and I've taken it to heart, is just listen to your breath and listen to your body, and what is that telling you? And is your heart telling you the same thing?
We can get really into, in yoga, we call them vrittis, like the churnings and the turnings of our mind. And so when I hear you describe that, I have that whole feeling of the moments where we go into our heart, go into our bodies, connect with breath, kind of let that chatter simmer down. And there's some other wisdom there, right? There's some answer, and it might even just be like, "I'm tired." Like, and it could be as simple as that, and I would say, like, 90% of the time, that's what my body says. Just lay down, girl, face down, shavasana right now. But taking that moment to attune, I think, is really powerful, and sometimes I've noticed with the pandemic that we feel frozen or exhausted or tired, and we absolutely do need rest, but I think we also need engagement. We also need those moments of connection, because I've found, "Oh, I'm so ti like, oh, let me listen to my body, and I'm tired," and then, "Oh, but I get to see this person," and, like, the whole energy comes. Um, it's so fascinating. So, but just stopping and listening, I kinda take away from what you're sharing. And one more question I have for you, what gives you hope these days?
That's a very hard question. I think there's so much happening in the news. What gives me hope is that I think self sabotage is a very real thing. How can you think outside of that, right? And that goes back to like not only listen to your thoughts, but listen to what your heart is saying, right? Like, does your thoughts align with your feelings? And if so, why is that? If there's a disconnect, why is that? I think that gives me hope, being able to trust myself every step or with everything I do, right? Like being able to say, like, okay, this is good for me.
That's very empowering, right? To shift from all the out there or the sabotage to, back to yourself and back to your choice. So how can people connect with you? How can people take your classes if they're in the area? Where do people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on social media. It's Erica Chang and underscore. You could also find me on Facebook. I currently teach at a local climbing gym in Tacoma, so you can find me teaching there on Mondays and Wednesdays. I'm teaching at a yoga retreat in Baja, Mexico in September. I did that last summer, so they asked me to do it again, so I'm super excited. And then I'm also teaching classes at the Tacoma Art Museum once a month, so that is also happening as well.
Amazing. Amazing. And do you have a website?
I do not, but folks can always email me or follow me on social media.
Okay, so social media is the best place to go. All right, everybody. Erica Chang, thank you so much for being here. And I just wish we could go back to the yoga room in San Francisco and play some Outcasts right now and just do a little flow for old time's sake.
Yeah, totally. It was so much fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the full transcript of each show. Thanks so much for your messages, feedback, and ideas about the podcast. I love hearing from you, and I so appreciate your support. There are lots of ways you can support the show, and I'm grateful for every little bit of love you share. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube to get updates every week. You can always visit howwecanheal.com/podcast to share your thoughts and ideas. I love hearing from you, so keep your comments coming. If you'd like to stay connected in between episodes, you can also text me. Text the word HEAL to 888-858-0811. That's 888-858-0811. I went for the number with a lot of eights in it. I'll send you some inspiration and support a few times a month, and you can text me back there too. Before we wrap up, I want to be clear that this podcast isn't offering any prescriptions. It's not advice or any kind of diagnosis. Your decisions are in your hands, and we encourage you to consult with any relevant healthcare professionals you may need to support you through your unique path of healing. I'd also like to send thanks to our guests today, to Christine O'Donnell and Celine Baumgartner of Bright-Sided Podcasting, and to everyone who helped support this podcast directly and indirectly. Alex, thanks for taking the dogs out while I record. Lastly, I'd love to give a shout out to my big brother, Matt, who passed away in 2002. He wrote this music, and it makes my heart so happy to share it with you now.